Well, a very, very good morning, everybody. Hi, it's Kasim, and welcome back to my podcast. I really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. It is, I was saying, a very good morning, but actually, I would say a very hot morning. We are in July at the moment of 2025, and let me tell you something. Yesterday was 32 degrees, and my God, was it hot. And as many of you will know, I live in Berkshire, in Reading, which is not too far away from London. And London has a certain type of heat. It is hot, 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 hot. Anyway, so today I want to talk to you about what every adopted boy or man should know before they search for their birth parents. And I want to begin with a statement. I thought I'd feel whole after I found her, but instead I just felt confused. She didn't remember the same details I had memorized my whole life. She didn't want to talk about why. It helped knowing that I wasn't the only one who felt let down. So, why do I want to talk about this subject of adoption and mental health and counseling? In recent years, social media platforms like Facebook, online genealogy services like Ancestry, and as well as DNA testing have given boys and men growing up adopted new ways of essentially searching for their birth parents, which has meant that many times they've often bypassed the usual channels, and sometimes going around the what may be considered as the gatekeepers or the keepers of the information, such as their adopted family or social workers. While this can bring answers, it can also bring and open up a can of worms and bring up all kinds of emotions. Families can be caught off guard. Relationships can become strained or broken. Emotions can run high, and old wounds may resurface sometimes without warning. Because adoption is so deeply personal and layered with emotional complexity, counseling and professional services are essential. Hence why I have a counseling practice called Male Minds Counseling, and I wanted to talk about this subject because up until recently, only qualified counselors registered with a recognized with recognized bodies were trusted to work with an adopted adult, and there is good reason for that. Adoption involves trauma, identity, grief, and often lifelong feelings that are difficult to navigate alone. And so I want to actually, before we begin, answer a couple of questions which people sometimes find interesting. One of the first questions that people may find interesting is when did the law change around adoptees accessing their birth information in the UK? Because many people aren't actually aware that in 1976, the Adoption Act came into force. Which was actually implemented in 1977, where for the first time, adopted adults who were 18 years of age in England and Wales could gain the legal right to access the original birth records, because prior to this, they couldn't do it. And one of the key things, as I've just talked about, is that they had to attend a counseling session first with a social worker or an adoption agency, especially if the adoption occurred after the 12th of November, 1975. One of the other things that people may be interested in, I found it out on a course, is that there was actually a surge in adoption, sort of between the 1940s and the 1950s. Why? Um, well, it's quite well documented about this massive surge after post-World War II. Firstly, there was wartime disruption. Many children were born out of wedlock during and after World War II. There was social stigma, single mothers, and single motherhood was heavily stigmatized. There was limited welfare support. So women had few economic or social options, and adoption was really one of the only choices that they had. And there was an increased rise in closed adoptions. So these were typically secretive, and children were often never told that they were even adopted. And just to give you some statistics, by 1968, there were approximately 27,000 children who were adopted annually, mostly newborns from unmarried mothers. And I'm sure you can understand how this has had an impact because if people were born in the 1950s, can you imagine them finding out that they were adopted because of these ancestry, you know, people in COVID, they send off their thing and they think this is who their mother is or who their father is, and then all of a sudden they discover this is not who they think they are. All kinds of things. So you may be interested to know the same question, which I was interested to know, which is why were adoptees not allowed to find out about their birth parents before that act of 1976? So, from the first Adoption Act, there was such a thing as closed adoptions. So, a closed adoption was just normal. So, from the first Adoption Act in 1926, adoption became a legal break from the birth parents and from the child. So, that meant that the child was issued a new birth certificate showing that the adoptive parents as the legal parents. And essentially, the original birth record was sealed and inaccessible to the adoptees. The logic behind this was low, that adoption was meant to provide a fresh start for the child, the adopted family and parents, and even the birth parents, who were often unmarried, massively stigmatized, massively under a lot of pressure, right? We have to remember that there was a lot of social attitudes, stigma, shame, and secrecy. Unmarried mothers were massively shamed, massively. Not that anything really has even changed that much, but they were massively changed back then. Adopted parents were often encouraged to raise a child as if they were born to them. And essentially, the professionals believed that secrecy was protecting everyone, the child from the shame and illegitimacy, the adoptive family to create a clean break, and the birth mother from lifelong stigma. So as a result, most adoptees weren't even told that they were adopted, as I said earlier on, and they only found out accidentally when they got older. So what changed? So by the 1960s and 70s, look, attitudes had begun to change. Psychological research showed that secrecy could harm adoptees. Adult adoptees demanded the right to know where they came from. They wanted to know their lineage and their heritage. Social work practice moved more towards sort of openness and identity development. And that is what led to the Adoption Act of 1976, which gave the adoptees, anyone aged 18 plus, the right to access their original birth certificate and begin tracing their relatives. But one of the stipulations was that counseling was required before disclosure, to sort of prepare the adoptee emotionally. Now, part of the reason why I'm saying all of this is because I'm sure you can imagine in 2025, there is a lot of people who don't. In fact, I'm going to get to this in a second because let me just explain this. Why was counseling required before adoptees could access their birth information? So post 1977. So when the Adoption Act of 1976 gave adoptee adults the right to access their original birth certificate, it also included a stipulation, which is that they had to attend a counseling session first, especially if that adoption had occurred from and after the 12th of November 1975. And essentially, the first reason was that it was really to prepare the person for the emotional impact. Finding out about your birth name, the name of your birth mother, your learning about the circumstances of your adoption can be an extremely emotionally intense exercise and period in your life. So counseling was meant to essentially prepare adoptees for the shock of unfamiliar names or details, the reality that a union might not be possible, and the risk of rejection or discovering distressing circumstances, e.g., like rape, abuse, poverty, that kind of thing. The idea was, look, the truth might not be what you hope for, and counseling was aimed to reduce that harm. The other thing that I think is important to remember is that to fill in the gaps about the adoption process, many adoptees have never been told how they were adopted or learn and they've only learnt about it in their adulthood. So what counseling was supposed to do and is supposed to do is that it helps to give the historical context of the adoption, why records were sealed, and how to navigate contact with birth family if they choose to actually stay in your life. The other thing was it was to protect the birth parents and adoptive families. Some birth parents were told their identities would remain confidential forever, remember? And so counseling helped adoptees understand boundaries, consent, and as I say, the possibility that actually them introducing themselves to the family might have an impact on the adoptive families who may not support the search. And the other last reason it was to ensure that support was available. You know, excuse me, searching for your birth parents is a big psychological event, as I said earlier on. So counseling was a way to make sure that adoptees weren't doing it in isolation or during a very vulnerable state. Okay. Now, the reason why I've been saying all of that is because today, um, while the requirement for counseling today, but essentially counseling isn't mandatory. The law changed. It is strongly recommended, which is why I wanted to do this podcast today and talk about this. It is a lot of people, because of the internet and social media and ancestry and all of these different platforms, people are able to reach out and find their biological parents very easily. The problem is, if they don't go counseling or they've not gone through the formal channels, all kinds of issues can start to occur. Um, and so one of the things that maybe might be useful for me to talk about is why could only certain counselors, because many people don't actually realize that only certain counselors could work with people who are adopted. So maybe it might be useful for me to talk about why it was that certain counselors um, had to work with adoptees after they requested their birth information. So when that Adoption Act of 1976 gave adults essentially the right to access the original birth records. As I said earlier on, there was that added stipulation that they had to receive counseling from a qualified person on an approved list, meaning that before they are given that identifiable information, um, this wasn't couldn't just be any other counselor. It had to be somebody who was approved by the Secretary of State or an appointed intermediary, such as like a social worker trained in adoption, a counselor, or an agency registered with an approved adoption support agency, a local authority social services team with experience in adoption. Right. And I guess there were kind of three reasons for this. One was a safeguarding. So adoption reunions can be emotionally intense and disruptive, and only trained professionals were trusted to handle this. Consistency, meaning that counseling needed to follow specific legal and ethical framework, such as confidentiality, mutuality, and then there was the historical secrecy. So many adoptions involve secrecy, stigma, shame, trauma, where you have people who are forced adoptions. So only trained professionals could handle this sort of disclosure with sensitivity. Um, and so, as I've been saying, there's been a lot of people who've started to find out by accident through their own children, through ancestry, that they're adopted. And they've started to find and seek their original birth family out. And it can be quite a stressful time. I don't know if you know that around 4,500 children are adopted in the UK each year. Many of them are boys and young men looking for a permanent home and identity. Over 60% of the children adopted from care in the UK are boys, and yet the emotional struggles boys face after adoption often go unspoken. Many adopted men report feeling a sense of otherness or not quite belonging, even in a loving family. Sort of a feel, and that feeling can kind of last into adulthood, which many people are shocked by because they're like, well, Kasim, if you've been adopted by a loving family, you should be happy, everything should be rosy. But that's not always the reality. In fact, research shows that adopted adults are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and difficulties forming close relationships that than non-adopted adults. Nearly one in three adopted adults have searched for their birth parents, but few, more than half, find the answers they were hoping for. Boys and men who are adopted often face unique challenges around identity, trust, expressing emotions, partly because of the societal expectations of masculinity. Despite these challenges, many men find that therapy and support groups helps them make sense of their adoptive story and find peace. So this is why I wanted to talk about this subject because I think it's really, really important because you may be married to somebody who goes, a man who goes and attempts to try to find their adopted families. Many of you will know that uh, I run a counseling practice called Male Minds Counseling, and I see this a lot. Many people come into me because they're coming to me to tell me that their partner, their husband, is really, really struggling, is trying to reach out to their family, and this can sometimes actually change the dynamic. So one of the things I do a lot in therapy is actually I have to answer a lot of questions. Some of the things that I've just explained to you, a lot of people don't know. Right? Adoption can bring hope and love and second chances, but it can also carry deep emotional wounds, confusion, um, and the struggles can show up years later, right? Whether you're an adoptee, an adoptive parent, or someone working with adopted people, the questions can come up. Let me tell you some questions which I get a lot. People sometimes say, why is it that I feel rejected even though I was adopted into a loving family? Well, the answer is that even when adoption happens for the best reasons, the early separation from your birth parents can leave a lasting sense of loss or rejection. This is sometimes called a primal wound in psychotherapy. Something felt before you even had the words for it. It can show up later in life as people pleasing, difficulty trusting other people, or a fear of being left again. There is also this question that people ask, why don't I feel like I belong anywhere? Well, the answer to that is a lot of adopted people describe this feeling of not quite fitting in, not in their adopted family, not in their cultural background, or even with friends. This sense of otherness can be rooted in early disconnection and identity confusion. And therapy can sort of help the person try to piece this together, try to piece their story and rebuild a sense of self, identity, and belonging. One of the things that people ask is it normal to feel angry after you've been adopted? And the answer is yes. Many adoptees feel angry at different times. This can surface up in when they're sat on a train, when they've watched a movie. This can be at their birth parents, at the system, or even at their adopted parents. Right? This anger often comes from a place of pain or confusion. It doesn't mean that you're ungrateful or bad. It just means that you're human. And therapy offers a sort of a safe place to be able to unpack those feelings without judgment, and with somebody who can actually handle the weight of what you're talking about. Some people sometimes ask, why is it that my adopted child keeps pushing me away when all I do is love them? And the answer to this is that children with early trauma often struggle to accept love, not because they don't want it, but because they don't trust it. Being close can feel scary or unfamiliar. What looks like rejection is often protection. And this is again is where therapy for you, your child, and both can help untangle these responses and build stronger connections over time. As I said earlier on, there is a hidden struggle of particularly adult men, which have been affected by adoption. I said earlier on that adoption is often talked about as sort of a happy ending. A child in need finds a loving home. But for many adoptees and adoptive parents, the story doesn't stop there. Adoption can leave behind invisible scars, deep emotional confusion, and struggles that carry on well into adulthood, right? Feelings of rejection or abandonment, a constant alertness for being left or not wanted again. Struggling with identity, many people don't feel like they fully know who they are or where they belong. There isn't a clear sense of safety or trust. This can make relationships difficult and sometimes exhausting. A need for control, trying to manage everything tightly as a response to having no say in their adoption. We also have coping through harmful behaviors such as drinking, drugs, stealing, hoarding, disordered eating, or self-harm. Right? There are some people, how it presents is that they're always on guard, a sort of a state of hypervigilance where anxiety runs constantly in the background. And I've already talked about that sense of being different, that otherness, right? Of not quite fitting in, even in your own family. And I've talked a little bit about the confusion around love and attachment, especially when self-worth and confidence are missing. Many adopted adults describe relationships that describe relationships that feel risky, confusing, or unsafe. Some may find themselves in abusive or controlling relationships, often without even realizing why. Adoption also brings complex family dynamics. Adopted people may have birth siblings they never met, or may have been treated differently to biological children in their adopted family, even when surrounded by love. They may feel a deep sense of gratitude mixed with guilt, and then they may be unsure of how to express that sort of anger, the grief, or the pain in case they seem ungrateful. So, one of the things that is massive that we look at in therapy is we look at what people need to know before they start finding their birth parents. As I said earlier on, everyone tends to think that they build up this narrative. Many, not everyone, many people build up this narrative of what they think their adopted family is and why they were adopted. And remember, some people don't even realize that they were adopted. And then so they have to go through that whole searching and narrative and trying to the confusion and the anger, and they're trying to piece everything together. So one of the things that we do in therapy, and this is part of the reason why, it's useful to speak to a professional before starting that journey, is that you might find that things that you weren't prepared for, right? Some birth parents may have criminal histories, which may have included violence, sex offenses, or abuse. You may discover siblings you didn't know about, right? Of whom you may not want contact with, or who may want contact with you, but you're not ready for. You might find out they were um, really very painful circumstances as to how you were conceived, such as, rape or trafficking. Your birth parents may be struggling with mental illness, addiction, or homelessness, right? These truths can be deeply disorientating. And this again is where I see therapy comes in. Your birth parents may not want to be found. As I said, part of the reason why there were these closed adoptions was because a lot of people did not want to be found out. They don't want to go through the story. They've got rid of that part of their life. And so all of a sudden, the feelings of being rejected all over again start to surface again. Some people go into a search hoping for a warm reunion, but are instead met with silence, avoidance, and outright rejection. Not everyone wants to reopen the past. Not everyone. Some may have never told their current family about about you and the child that they gave up. Others may still feel and carry shame, guilt, or denial. It's painful, really, 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 really painful, right? So one of the other things, of course, is closure. You might feel more unsettled, not less. Many people think that if they can find their birth parents or they can find certain information, then they will have closure. Sometimes that is not how it works. The fantasy does not always match reality. Many adoptees imagine that they re they imagine the reunion for years, what they'll say, how they feel, um, but the real person might be nothing like they pictured. They might be cold, defensive, emotionally distant. They might have nothing in common. They might not look like each other. They might deny the truth or rewritten history. They may feel no emotional connection at all. And this can be crushing, right? The impact might even hit way long after this. Even if the reunion goes well, it can still sort of shake the person's sense of self. They can start to question their identity. They can start to question relationships, their upbringing, their values. They start going through grief, the loss, the guilt, the confusion. Firstly, one of the things that we do is that in therapy in particular, and this is why I encourage people to come to therapy, um, is we can handle the weight of that, but we can begin to explore some of this because there is no shame, there is no stigma. Um, and as professionals, we can handle the level of what people want to share. DNA tests can reveal more than what you bargain for, right? These days, many people find relatives, as I said earlier on, through services like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, and sometimes without meaning to, right? They might find those siblings, their cousins, parents. There is a lot of things that some families keep buried and keep under the rug. Okay. So, as I said earlier on, this is where therapy might be able to come in because therapy offers a place to explore grief, fear, anger, loss. It helps adoptees find the language for what they've never been able to say. It supports parents in making a sense of their own emotions, as well as their child's behavior. And it creates a possibility of safety, belonging, and healing. Adoption is full of love, but it's also full of complexity. And that's okay. Therapy doesn't take away from the pain, but it gives people the tools to be able to live with it, understand it, and grow from it. So I want to talk a little bit about the different ways in which people are adopted in the UK. And there are loads of different ways. So people can be adopted through their local authority or public adoption. They can go through private adoption. So this is where you see like sort of step parents or relative adoption. They can go through fostering for adoption, which is called early permanence. There is also adoption from overseas, so intercountry adoption, and there is kinship adoption. That's where you got family, and this is what I see a lot, where grandparents, cousins, close family friends end up adopting somebody. I wanted to also talk about some books that may be useful. Earlier on, I talked about the primal wound. And I'm talking about books that may be useful for adopted boys in particular, boys or men. There's a really interesting book called The Primal Wound by Nancy Newton Verrier. This classic sort of addresses the core emotional pain many adoptees experience. And of course, as I'm sure you know, no boys are no exception to this. And it helps sort of men understand the feelings of loss and identity that can often stay unspoken. There is Raising Boys with ADHD by Marianne Ritchie. There's Lost and Found, Adopting the Hurt Child. There is Adopted for Life by Russell D. Moore. There is Boys and Young Men in Therapy by Mark D. Griffith, The Mask of Masculinity by Lewis Howes, and No More Mr. Nice Guy by Robert Glover. That's a very interesting book which addresses the patterns of people pleasing and hidden anger that some adopted men might experience as a reaction to early abandonment or trauma. As a general rule, I'd always recommend for anyone who's adopted or adoptive parents, The Primal Wound, as I said, by Nancy Newton. There is also 20 Things Adopted Kids Wish Their Adoptive Parents Knew. That's really good by Sherry Eldridge. The Adopted Triangle, Adoption Dynamics by Margaret Bomier and Rita J. Simon. The Connected Child by Catherine Purvis and David Ross. The Lost Daughter by Jenny Wren. Adopted for Life by Russell D. Moore, which I talked about earlier on. And Adoption, What Parents and Parents to Be Need to Know by Jane Blunden. So, um, um, that's kind of it, really. Now the crux of what I wanted to talk about when it comes to adoption and it comes to this topic, because it is a very, very complicated topic. It is a very sensitive topic that needs support. Um, that it's really, really, really difficult, for people to handle. And this is why I want to talk about it. And I encourage anyone who is going through that process or needs support to go to therapy, to have a chat with us. We can really, really, really help in therapy, especially those who are trained, because it's a very difficult process to go through but oh my goodness, my light has gone off. It is a very, very difficult process to go through all by yourself. So thank you very, very, very much for listening as usual. I really appreciate it. I hope this has been useful in some way. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. But otherwise, I will speak to you very, very soon. Bye for now.